Well, welcome to the course. Um, my objective in this course is to not only meet your expectations as you've indicated them to me by filling in that form, apart from the few of you who haven't, but also I think you'll find that, at least for most of you, you'll go away from the course with a different view on the landscape. It will change your concepts about how nature works, and hopefully you'll be able to put that into practical use. That's the sort of feedback that I generally get from people. Some people, quite a few people, so it's completely changed the way they look at the landscape. And I think that's a wonderful thing. So that's what I'm striving for. At the very least, I think you won't be disappointed. Now, this session is coming to you from me in Wurundjeri country, and I think many of us are from Wurundjeri country. I think some of us are probably from Bunurong country. What other country do we have people from that we should acknowledge? Not getting any others at the moment. At any rate, I wish to recognise that we're on traditional land wherever we happen to be, and I pay my respects to their elders, the traditional owner elders, past, present and emerging. And we'll also be thinking of that at each of our 3 field sites, and all 3 of them are on Wurundjeri country. It just turns out that the Wurundjeri people have an extremely diverse landscape, which is to serve their lifestyle so well. Now, let's see. I think that's all the preamble sort of stuff I need to go to. I've given you a whole lot of resources to download and look at, and a YouTube video to view, and an exercise to do. Now, Kynan's only stepped into the breach in the past hour. He didn't know he was going to do this course until the past hour, so he hasn't had time to do the exercise and so on. I'm hoping the rest of you have, and that you've got some specimens with you. You will get a little more out of this session if you've got some specimens to look at when I explain things. I will be showing you specimens, but there's no substitute for having them in your hands and being able to look at them up close and all that sort of stuff. So you've got various resources. Today, in this particular webinar, my objective is to explain to you the structure of a grass plant and give you all the basic introduction that you need before going out into the field tomorrow, so that when we see all the plants in situ, you'll know what I'm talking about if I talk about a ligule or that sort of stuff, and we can get stuck straight into it. So today is really preparation, so you get the maximum benefit from the 4 hours that we've got together tomorrow. And for that, I'm relying on, well, I'm not just relying on it, I'm going to cover the notes called Wild Grasses of Southeastern Australia. That's the, it covers more than I'm going to cover during our sessions together. Some of the content of those notes is stuff that you can just as easily read as have me talk about, whereas you will have found already, I think, in trying to learn about grasses, you can't really do it from a book or from a website or that sort of thing. You need to actually see things in the field and be shown things on real grasses. And I've done the best I can with that YouTube video, as I will do in this webinar. But there's only so much you can do by reading and looking at things other than with somebody who can point things out. So that's what I'm going to concentrate on during our time together. And I'm leaving you to read pages 1 to 4 of the Wild Grasses of Southeastern Australia notes. It covers a bit about the diversity of grasses, their importance, other families of plants that you could confuse with grasses. I will be showing you representations of each of those, but there's a little bit of context information that's at the start of the notes. It also gives you a bit of advice about what equipment might be useful, such as hand lens and 2 pairs of watchmaker's forceps or very fine pointed tweezers, that sort of stuff. You don't need to hear me prattle on about that. We've got to spend our precious time together doing practical stuff. So that's why I'm leaving you to read notes pages 1 to 4. And the following pages, section 2.1 to 2.5 or thereabouts, is what I'm going to be covering this morning. The structure of a grass plant and what we can learn from the structure, the nomenclature that goes with the different parts of the grass plant and so on. Then we'll put it into practice tomorrow. Okay, now having encouraged you to ask questions, are there any questions on all of that background sort of stuff? Remember to unmute yourself first. No? Okay, good. We can get stuck into things. I thought a good way of engaging with you to start with, which is a bit harder in a webinar than when we're in the room together, is to ask you about the specimens you've collected. Now, Kyna's not in a position to participate very much in this, having not had the time to do it. But for the rest of you, I'm hoping that you have had time to go out and collect some specimens. And I asked you to collect, firstly, at least one of the really common, quite useful grasses for learning about structure of plants. And those species were prairie grass, Bromus catharticus, and or large quaking grass, Bryza maxima, and or the bearded oat, or any other oat that you find, but you'll probably find bearded oat, Avena barbata. So hopefully you found at least one of those. Nearly all of us will find at least 2 within 100 metres of our home, if not on our back steps or somewhere like that. The other specimens that I asked you to collect were some specimens that differ in as many ways and as profoundly as possible from those other 3 species that I've just mentioned. And the reason I did that is to get you to look at the different parts of the grass plant that I introduced in the YouTube video, things like the stems and the leaf structure and the seeds and the arrangements of the seed-bearing spikelets, as they're called, within the seed head or inflorescence. And I'm wondering what you came up with for the plant that differed to the maximum degree from the 3 that I introduced you to in the video. So what I'd like is for anybody who's game, and you don't have to be that game, to unmute yourself and tell me what you found as your number 1 species that you think is completely different in as many ways as possible from the basic ones, and tell me what those differences are. Who's got a response to that, please?
I'll jump in and break the ice. I gathered 2 of the weedy species that you mentioned, Graham, the Bromus and the Avena, and then managed to find a few native samples as well. But I reckon the sample that I got that sort of differed the most, I believe, is a pennisetum, an introduced fountain grass. Very purple in the foliage. It's quite a common ornamental species that I see around that people, I think, often confuse for a native. So that the color of foliage was probably the first vast difference. You know, there's basically no green on the plant whatsoever. And in regards to sort of flower head, it is flowering at the moment and much more sort of fluffy, I suppose, than anything we see, you know, maybe apart from a very dry rotidosperma, but still quite fluffy through sort of all stages of the flowering. A bit of purple up in the seed head as well, which is a bit different to what we sort of commonly see in our grasses. Quite a few seeds per raceme, I think it would be, or spike. And yeah, that's my sort of differing species at the moment.
Ryan, do you actually have one there, and can you put it in front of your face so that we can see what it looks like?
I can. I don't know whether my background is exactly. I might be able to do it against my shirt. There's the seed head there, and there's a bit of the foliage that everyone should be able to see against my shirt there, sort of a dark purple maroon, almost sort of down to like a very dark brown in some spots.
Are those stems branched, Ryan?
They are.
So that would be another thing that's profound. The things that struck you as making it different are the general impression and shape sort of things, the jizz things, as they say. But there are lots of other profound differences, and the branching of the stems I immediately noticed. Most people, even botanists, don't even pay attention to whether there's branching or not, but some grasses branch, some branch a lot, most don't branch at all. That one's got branching. Another thing is that after the seeds have shed from your fountain grass or pennisetum, that one's probably Alopecuroidea, I think, the seeds fall off with the whole spikelets intact, and it just leaves a slender vertical central stem from which everything has fallen off. Whereas in all of the other, well, the other three grasses, you're left with pairs of husks called glooms after the seeds have fallen. So that was a good example. Who's next?
Yeah, I'll go next if you like, Graham. So as well as the three, we asked to collect the Bromus, Avena, and now was Kikuyu, which is growing throughout my lawn. I'm trying to get rid of it, but the differences being it's a rhizomatous species. No flower heads on it at the moment because they probably got cut up with the last lawnmower. But that's probably the biggest difference in the species I've got.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad you got that one. I got a specimen of that too, but you might find that it is actually in flower and you didn't notice it. It's certainly worthy of being regarded as completely different because it's, well, for a reason that's represented in its scientific name. Scientifically, Kikuyu is called Cenchrus clandestinus, and let me just show you the specimen that I collected. I'm just swapping to a camera in front of me, and here is the tip of a specimen from my lawn, and you can see some white thread-like bits in sticking out the leaf sheaths. They're feathery because they capture the pollen on the wind. These are the stigmas that you see there, and the actual rest of the flower, other than the stigmas, this is a female shoot, other than the stigmas, the rest of the flower is tucked down in each of the leaf sheaths, hence clandestine, as in Cenchrus clandestina. There are separate male shoots, and instead of having the feathery bits stick up, they put up their thread-like filaments vertically upwards, usually about 4 or 5 centimeters long, sticking well above the sward of the grass, and with little anthers on the end from which the pollen is released. So that is really weird, including within its own genus of Cenchrus. So I'd certainly pass that one as very different. So you can go to the head of the class on the basis of that for the next few seconds, I think, Paul. Good. Who's got something else?
Hi, Graham. I found Bryza maxima to be very distinct, not the vegetative structure, but more the flowering structure. I feel like the fact that the glooms are pretty much inside each other and towering makes it stand out against other grasses in a field of ways. I feel like the attention always goes to Bryza because they're very distinct.
Yes, it's again, that's a general impression and shape sort of thing. What I'm going, and this is very helpful to me to hone what I should be working on. I've never done this quite before, and it's good to see what people's initial impression at the start of this course is like. And so far, each of you have focused on the overall impression of something rather than technical difficulties. Maybe a botany student like Shelby might have focused on some of the more technical differences. Thank you, Gil. That's very useful. I wonder if Shelby, I don't want to put you on the spot, but did you find anything of particular interest in this regard?
Not really. I have a specimen that I actually haven't figured out if it's Phalaris or cocksfoot. I apologize, I'm losing my voice, so that's why I'm a bit shy to speak today. But I did notice the stem is not perfectly round. So, and I'm pretty sure that would be a defining feature. So compared to the oat and the prairie grass, they seem to have round stems, I think. Oh no, the prairie grass isn't maybe perfectly round. It's hard to tell when they're all dried.
Yeah, it would have been pretty close to round. Oh, well done. So you've validated my suspicion that a botany student looks at things more closely and finds those less obvious characters. By character, that's a term that biologists use as just for the features that one might characterize a plant by. So depending on whether that, well, I guess it must be cocksfoot rather than Phalaris, Shelby, because Phalaris has round stems and, well, it's not so much the stems. What you put your fingers around, let me grab an example. I will can probably do it this way. In front of me, you can see a stem and it has sheaths along it, and there are blades. And as I roll my fingers around it, this one is oval in cross section. I'm not sure whether we can make it. Yeah, I think you can see that it's sort of oval in cross section. That's paspalum, as it happens. Most grasses have got round cross sections, but cocksfoot, the sheath has a fold along the edge, so it doesn't roll around in your fingers anywhere near as smoothly. So that's good. Does anybody else have another grass that they want to put up as a contender for something completely different before we move on?
Certainly, I got at one that actually I noticed that it's quite of velvety. It has a lot of hairs. I don't know if you, I haven't identified,
Okay.
but by touching it, it feels velvety and really, really soft.
I reckon that'll be Yorkshire fog.
It's extremely long, and this is
yeah, there we go. Now I can see the ripening seed head. That's Yorkshire fog or Holcus lanatus. So the feel is the thing that made you think of that as different. Oh, that's good. Again, another general impression and shape sort of thing. I think we can leave that there. I'll just give you a couple of examples of things that I reckon trump even the kikuyu. Like, probably I'll just do one at the moment. Bamboo. Bamboo is woody, of course, we know what it's like, and it's the only grass that you'll encounter around your part of the landscape, I think, that produces wood. Its flowers are radically different. You don't often see them, but the flowers, when they come out, are radically different. You can see that it's profoundly branched, and branched in a rather unusual way for a grass. The leaves are different. They have a little leaf stalk, which you might not be able to see there, but in between the leaf blade and the sheath, it's got a little stalk. There are two completely different sorts of sheaths. There are the sheaths of the leaves that have blades, so you can see, I'll perhaps swap to the other camera to make it a bit clearer. You can see that I have here a leaf sheath, a leaf blade that I'm now holding with my left hand, and it is attached to a sheath that encircles the stem there. But in addition to those leaves, it has these non-photosynthesizing bladeless sheaths all up the stem. On some species of bamboo, these sheaths can be 1/2 metre long and about 30 centimetres in girth, wrapped around the stems. So bamboo would be a standout example of something completely different. And the other one that it would be worth mentioning is kangaroo grass, which I will discuss more later and explain why it is so different. But certainly from a general impression and shape point of view, I hope you would agree that it's pretty distinctive. Most of you, I expect, can probably already recognise kangaroo grass just by the general impression and shape of the thing. Okay, that was a useful exercise. We don't have time to spend any more time on it, but it helps me hone what I can do for you. And perhaps I'll just ask you to, now under reactions, I suppose we've got hands up, have we? Yeah, you can give me a thumbs up or something like that, or a tick using the reactions thing at the bottom there, if you found it useful to do that exercise of collecting your grass specimens. Yeah, I'm looking through, I'm finding ticks everywhere. Very good. Okay. Yeah, excellent. Okay, then we will move on. Now, I'm going to share my screen with some PowerPoint slides. Give me a moment while I get that up. Okay, I'm hoping that everybody can now see the introductory screen there, and I will move on. Okay, now the slides that I'm about to show you can be downloaded from my website. You don't necessarily have to write this down now. There will be a slide at the end that has it as well. But if you go to my website and look for well, I'll put it up at the end. That's probably the easiest way of doing it. Now, let's talk about the structure of a grass plant. We're going to talk about the terminology that goes with it and that sort of thing. And I see there's a couple of things there on chat, nothing that needs my attention. We'll start at the base of the plant and work our way up. Now, firstly, the root system. As I think I mentioned in the introductory YouTube video, some grasses are really easy to pull up, and I gave you ones that are pretty easy, particularly the large quaking grass. It has very shallow, fine roots. The prairie grass will be considerably harder because it's a perennial, but a short-lived perennial. And oat, depending on the soil in which it's growing, might be a bit hard, but not too hard. As we start to look at things in the field like kangaroo grass, or Ryan, when you collected your fountain grass, you may have found that very hard to get it out with the roots intact. Tomorrow, we'll do a bit of practicing using the Lorimer jiggling method to gently pull a plant out. And if it's an annual species that you're jiggling, it will pull out fairly readily, and you'll see that there are just really fine roots on it, and they don't extend very far. Mind you, the oat, depending on the soil in which it's growing, can produce a more stout root system. But by and large, annual plants, whether they're grasses or not grasses for that matter, don't invest a lot of energy into a robust root system to carry them through the harsh part of the year. The harsh part of the year can vary from species to species because there are some species more adapted to hot, dry conditions, and some that thrive in cooler, moist conditions and so on. For most species in Victoria, the harsh period of the year is January, February, March. But there are some grasses that have not yet germinated for the season, annual species, and I'm thinking particularly of the annual love grasses, of which we have a few weeds, particularly Eragrostis mexicana, the Mexican love grass. It's going to germinate over the coming month, and it will flower through mainly February and March, and you'll see it on median strips and weedy roadsides and that sort of thing. So the harsh period of the year varies according to the biology of the individual species. But if you're an annual species, you don't worry about that harsh part of the year, because you can live fast and furious and produce copious seed, as they normally do, during the good time of the year. And you don't need that robust root system to get you through the harsh part of the year. So that's why we find that annual species, and even really short-lived perennial species like sweet vernal grass, don't invest in a robust root system, and so they're easy to pull out. That's really useful for a couple of purposes. Firstly, I know that many of you will want to be able to tell whether a grass plant is a native species, indigenous, or if it's been introduced. And it turns out that annual species in Victoria, other than to a lesser degree in the Mallee, elsewhere in Victoria and southeastern Australia, if a plant pulls out really easily, it will be an annual and it will be introduced, unless it is a blown grass or one of a couple of quite rare species. So it's now, I should hasten to add that that doesn't mean that all introduced species are annuals. There are certainly huge numbers of perennial introduced species. It's just that because of our landscape, the soil type and the climate, native species have rarely evolved to behave in an annual lifestyle. Whereas with the introduced species, we've got annuals and perennials. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Now, so if there we are, we've got something useful that if a plant pulls out easily, when you use this jiggling technique to pull it up, and you see that you've just got fine roots that don't extend very far, it's going to be, in nearly all cases, an introduced species, particularly if there's a fair bit of it, as there usually is, unless it happens to be a blown grass, particularly the common blown grass or Lachnogrostis filiformis. And I've got a photograph of that. I think you'll find this same photograph on the VicFlora website. Now, you can see the root system has been somewhat snapped off at the base there, but this would have been quite easy to pull out. You can see a maturing seed head or inflorescence there with its fine spreading branches, and they're called blown grasses because once the seed heads are ripe, they snap off and blow around on the wind. Now I'm going to unshare for a moment and swap to the other camera, so give me a moment. I've got a fresh specimen because you can only characterize it so much with a still photograph, excellent though that still photograph is. I'm just gently jiggling the thing around, and you can see that it's very floppy because of the very fine branches. A black background might have worked better with this, but then the automatic exposure on the camera suddenly overexposes the subject, so it doesn't really work up fine, but hopefully you can get the gist of it there. It's quite distinctive with these large floppy seed heads. The only thing that I think you could confuse this with is that if it's a lot smaller, and you can see the size of this relative to my hand, if it's a lot smaller, as sometimes this species might do, you might confuse it with the introduced silvery hair grasses. And I'll show you some of those out in the field just to make sure that you don't confuse those two. Silvery hair grasses do not have the delicate floppy branches, so that aspect of not just standing back and looking at a plant, but actually handling it, shake it, see if it flops around, is important. So that whole seed head is designed to snap off and blow around on the wind. And around Christmas time, after a breeze, you'll find these seed heads piling up against buildings and particularly against fences. So they get around the landscape very readily. And isn't that very typical of and annual plant species. Annuals, they live fast and furious, as I said, and they produce copious leaf seeds, which in nearly all species have to be spread across the whole landscape. For example, with the blown grass, the scientific name is Lachnogrostis filiformis. The filiform refers to the floppy, very fine branches. The lac bit refers to a lake. I think I should have checked the botanical Latin beforehand, shouldn't I? Agrostis does mean grass, so I think it means the grass of the lake. And you will find this in abundance where a lake dries out. In drying mud, that's where you'll find this species. It doesn't have to be a lake. It could be a puddle on a bush track. It could be a puddle in your driveway. I've got a wet species in a wet spot in my lawn, and that's where I collected my specimen from. So any drying mud, you will find this. If you're a species that relies on that sort of habitat, then you can't rely on it being there next year. So it's really useful to be able to spread across the landscape. So that's why this species is so good at spreading across the landscape. I'm just thinking one other species that you might confuse with this when you do see stuff piled up against fences around Christmas time. I can think of two. One is serrated tussock, which I expect we will see tomorrow. It's a very important weed of agriculture, and to a lesser degree in native grasslands. It has that same strategy of having a widely spreading seed head that blows around on the wind. And then there are the panicum species and their relatives, which also snap off and blow around the wind. And they're both natives and introduced in that species in that group. Okay, I've got to rush along. I always have trouble getting through everything that I want to in this first session. Now, not only is it useful to be able to detect whether a species is an annual or a perennial from the point of view of whether it's native or not, but it also tells us a lot about how you would manage the species, particularly if it's an introduced annual, as they nearly all are, and you want to get rid of them, as you might, particularly if you're managing a bit of native vegetation for conservation reasons. An annual species, as I said, produces copious seeds, and they are what an ecologist would call an opportunistic species. That means that as soon as there is a vacant ecological niche that might suit it, such as some drying mud, they get in there quickly, grow up, reproduce, that is, produce seeds very quickly, and then they can die. And so opportunistic, you can also call them pioneering species, because after a flood or a bushfire or something like that, they are amongst the first species to germinate. Sprouting species are actually the first ones to emerge, things like grass trees and mat rushes. But the first species to germinate are the, by and large, the annual species, and they're certainly the first ones to reproduce. And so once conditions are right for an annual grass species, or it could be a clover or a whole range of other non-grass species, as soon as the conditions are right, they all germinate. With the emphasis on all, they all germinate. Hardly any seeds are left in the ground. Think about that, what that means from the point of view of trying to eradicate them, if that's what you want to do. If you can kill all the plants after they've all germinated and before they've set seed, you have completely eradicated the annual grasses or whatever you're trying to get rid of. You want to do it selectively, of course. You probably don't want to get rid of all the perennials, and there are various ways that we'll talk about later as to how to do that. But the key to controlling annual grass weeds and also other types of annual weeds is to deprive them of their annual seed set. They really rely extremely heavily on their annual seed set. So your approach would be to kill them all by fire or crash grazing or selective herbicides, all of which we'll discuss later. And if you can do that before the first seeds are shed, then you won't have a problem next year, unless there's something like serrated tussock which is not an opportunistic annual. Other weeds can blow in, of course, from outside, but you will have removed them from the site, and that can help a lot. I'm about to move on unless somebody's got questions. Okay, I'm not getting any questions. That's good. That means I can keep on going. Hopefully it's not that you're all bored out of your brains and have tuned out. Now, I guess before I go on to the grass leaf structure, I should also deal with other aspects of the root system. Principally that you can have rhizomes as well as roots. Rhizomes are underground runners. They aren't roots. They've got leaves along them, and they can produce side shoots from the sheaths of those, the sheaths that are on the rhizome. We'll have a look at some rhizome producing species in due course. We'll do that tomorrow. Although there aren't many rhizome producing species out on the grasslands, particularly amongst the native species, which is totally different from the Northern Hemisphere. Oh, and Paul, you've been to North America. You probably went across the prairies, did you? Hello, Paul. No answer from Paul. In the prairies of the Northern Hemisphere, whether it be in Europe or in North America, or for that matter, if you go to the Pampa in South America, which I haven't done, there are lots of grasses that have big rhizome systems or underground runners, which we don't have in Australia. That's because they've got ungulates with hooves, and that makes it a real advantage to a grass to be able to sprout from something underground, because if you've got a herd of 1 million bison, as used to roam across the steppes and the prairies in North America and so on, or equivalents in South America, then everything above ground is left completely bare. But in Australia, we don't have those sorts of animals, which is in turn because of our ancient soils and soil fertility and so on. So our whole ecology and the sorts of species that have evolved with our fauna, and grasses have co-evolved with grazing animals, are completely different. And that has implications for when we put ungulates like horses and cattle on our country. Our country isn't adapted for that sort of thing. Okay, now there's something in chat which I should check. Okay, Lanchos from Greek. Well, I'm not sure what Lanchos from Greek for wool is about. Paul, you better tell us what you're saying about that. I'm not hearing from Paul.
Yeah, no, I'm still here. I did hear. I just looked on PlanetNet, and it says in there, I'll just find again, from the Greek lachnos, meaning wool.
Oh, okay.
So the lachna grasses must be wool because of the hairy nature of them.
It isn't at all. Oh, it's not at all woolly though. Usually in botanical Latin, as opposed to Greek, if you wanted to represent something being woolly, you would use lanuginos and the LAN root rather than an LACH. So that might be more investigation.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for investigating that, Paul.
And yes, I have been across the prairies.
All right, now, root systems are quite important, and they tell us about whether a species is native or introduced. They can tell us how well it's adapted to things like compacted soil. For example, brown top bent, a very common introduced species, is a symptom of compacted soil, and that's because it's got a robust root rhizome system. Okay. Just checking what the time is. Okay, 10:45. We're sort of on track. I'll press on unless anybody wants to raise any questions. No, okay. Grass leaf structure. You already know that a grass leaf has got a blade and a sheath and a definite junction between the two. That junction that we call the collar is the point at which new cells are put on for the leaf blade to grow. So the leaf blade starts off really short earlier on in the leaf's life, and it gradually extends by new cells being added at the base. The sheath does the same sort of thing. It's got the same sort of tissue that produces new cells. Meristem tissue is the name of that sort of tissue. So the sheath is growing from its base. Okay, so we've got those terms, the leaf sheath, the leaf blade, the collar, and there is a ligule on almost every grass species in Victoria. The echinocloas or barnyard grasses are the only grass species in Victoria that actually have no ligule. Ligules are important for identification because it turns out that they are one of only 2 parts of the grass plant that don't change in their size and thickness and shape and all those sorts of things according to their stage of growth once they're initially produced, or the growing conditions. The overall height of a grass plant in most species will vary enormously depending on, well, firstly its stage of growth, obviously, but also according to whether it's a good year or a bad year, or whether it's growing in a good bit of soil from its perspective, or marginal or adverse conditions, or whether it gets trampled. So lots of aspects of a grass plant with those general impression and shape sort of characters that people were using are variable. And that includes Corey's purplishness of the fountain grass. But the ligule and other aspects of the collar don't vary. At least they don't vary very much within a species, but they do vary quite a bit between species and between one genus and another. The other parts that are important because they don't vary much according to stage of development and the growing conditions are the spikelets in the seed head, which we'll deal with shortly. And the other thing is that if you've got a grass plant that you want to identify when they're not flowering, as a number of you said in your response to my query about what you wanted to get out of the course, then this is the spot where you will most commonly focus your attention. Leaf blades vary within a species, but the collar area and the ligule do not. So it's a really useful feature to be focusing on. Now, when you look at the leaf, you're going to be looking at how long and wide the leaves are, but bear in mind that those things will vary according to growing conditions and also how old the leaves are. And as I mentioned with bamboo, and also it applies to another species I've got a specimen of here, which is common reed or Phragmites australis, and a number of other species, there can be more than one sort of leaf on a plant. But in general, the length and width of the leaf can be useful, particularly if they're big, because if you've got a big leaf, it tells you that this species is capable of doing that. If you've got a small leaf, it may be because that species only ever produces a small leaf, or it could be because of adverse growing conditions, and under other conditions, it might produce much bigger leaves. So there's that limitation with the length and width, and also some of these other things. The cross-sectional shape of the leaf blade is important, and I've drawn there the V shape of when a leaf might have a folded along the midvein, and if you have a look at your specimens, you might find one that is like that. If you have a look at your prairie grass, prairie grass will have a bit of a V in it in most cases. Ultimately, it can flatten out a fair bit. The large quaking grass leaves will be flat unless you've got a really young one. If they've dried out a bit, your prairie grass might have curled in at the edges to look more like this third cross section. And if you've collected something like most of the native species of Poa, you might have a leaf with a cross section like this. So it's rolled in, they would call this in-rolled. or there are other terms like involute that is sometimes used by the botanists. So that might be language that would suit Shelby as a student. So these cross-sectional shapes are very useful as long as you have fresh material. When leaves dry out, as I said, your prairie grass specimen might be going a bit like the third one of these, whereas when it was fresh, it might be more like the first or a bit closer to flat. And quite a lot of grasses will completely roll in like this once they dry out. So noting what the cross-sectional shape of a fresh leaf is like is the useful aspect. Touchy-feely things like the floppiness are good and how hairy they are. Colour, well, Corey mentioned the purplishness that he noticed on his fountain grass. And one gets one's eye in for the colour, the particular shade of green of weeping grass, for example. Mind you, there are two colours for weeping grass, depending on which kind you've got. The glossiness and as well as hairiness, there's raspiness. When I teach people about botany out in the field, they stand back and watch me in nearly all cases. And I have to tell them, no, come in and touch these things. You need to get up close, you need to look at their little bits, and you have to handle them. And often the identification of a grass involves feeling how raspy the leaves are. I'll give you an example or some examples of that tomorrow, particularly I'm thinking Ostrostypa scabra versus Ostrostypa nodosa, the former of which has leaves that are incredibly raspy and the latter of which are practically smooth. But otherwise, the species are indistinguishable to me in the field. So roughness and those sorts of things. And for the bromus species, including the prairie grass that you might have collected during your exercise, if you have a look at the sheath, you'll find that, well, if you look at any of your other specimens, you'll find that the sheath is like, well, it encircles the stem except that it's split down its length, almost to the base, sometimes completely to the base, except with the bromus species. Oh, and also Festuca rubra, which might be in your lawn. Those species, or particularly the bromus, don't have this split going way down. I think of it as being like a V-neck or a plunging neckline, so that you will, well, sometimes you'll have to carefully tease apart the sheath to see that it is actually split. So it can be a bit tricky. With your oat, you'll often not initially notice that it's split, and you might need to pull it away a bit to see the split there. But with bromus species, no, you will see that it is definitely not split. It up around the collar area, you'll see that there's space from one side of the collar to the other around the stem, and it will taper into a V-neck sort of thing or a plunging neckline, depending on the particular species. And below that, it'll be convincingly totally tubular and not at all split. I call it the Lorimer décolletage method of identifying a bromus. Some women generally know what décolletage means, the rest of you don't worry. Okay, so I think that's enough on the leaf sheath and the leaf blade. There are some more things to do with the collar though. As I said, it's the go-to thing for identifying a grass that isn't in flower. I mentioned that grasses have collars and ligules. They've got this structure where there are 2 points on the grass leaf that grow, the base of the sheath and the base of the blade. So we've got collars. Look, sometimes it can be hard to see that there's a collar unless you look for it. The native poas are the ones that I'm thinking of in particular, but also probably Ostrostypa scabra, the species that I mentioned before. But when you do look for it, you will see that there isn't a definite collar there. But you'll also see that in some members of the sedge family, and that's true of all the Carex species, the biggest genus within the sedge family, the true sedges. And it also happens in a minority of the rush species in the genus Juncus. and the rest don't. So just seeing that you've got a collar doesn't necessarily mean you've got a grass. I will show you some things that not really grasses, but that you could reasonably confuse with a grass. This is one of the standard tests. A lamandra or matrush, for example, we will look at and see that it doesn't have this two-part structure. There is no collar. Okay, so that is useful. The next thing is, I've already dealt with it, ligules vary substantially between the species, but they don't vary much from one species to another, or, sorry, they do vary a fair bit from one species to another. They don't vary much within the species, regardless of the growing conditions or the stage of growth. When we look at the ligule, we're looking for things like how long it is, and that length won't vary much within a species. The shape of it, how hairy it is, how thick it is. Some of them are opaque, some of them are really delicate and completely transparent. And all of those things are useful for identification, sometimes within a genus like Amphibromus, sometimes to distinguish, and in POA, it's really used for POAs, because if you find a grass that's got a thin transparent ligule and you're pretty confident it's a POA, then it'll be an introduced one. And natives tend to have thick, hairy ligules. But if you can't see a ligule, it doesn't mean that it's the barnyard, it's one of the barnyard grasses, those few introduced species that really don't have them. Usually when you can't see a ligule on a grass, it's because they're so darn tiny. For example, with the wallaby grasses, the ligule is a line of hairs approximately 0.5 millimetre long, sometimes rather less. Lots of native grasses and some introduced grasses have ligules that are less than 0.5 millimetre long. You will need a hand lens to see them, particularly if you've got eyesight that is like mine. Don't fret if you can't see the ligule. That doesn't mean that you don't have a grass or that you've got a barnyard grass. There are other things around the collar other than just the ligule. On the left here, you'll see a photograph, which is also in the notes around section 2 point something. This is from the hill wallaby grass, or Ritidosperma erianthum, of which there is somewhere we're going tomorrow. Now, the ligule is down inside the leaf blade. So I'm pointing now to the leaf blade, and we've got the sheath here. I've pulled the sheath manually away from the stem so that you can see it as separate from the stem. And we've got these long hairs on the outside of the top of the sheath. It's not the ligule. The ligule's down inside that, the base of the inside of the blade. You can see that the blade in this case is a V-shaped cross section. If we were to go down that valley behind what I'm labeling here, the shoulders, I'm pointing at the shoulders of the leaf, then that's where the ligule would be, and it's a line of hairs 0.5 millimetre long, a lot shorter than even these hairs on the outside of the collar, or particularly these hairs, which are about 4 or 5 millimetres long on this species. And it turns out that wallaby grasses in practical, sorry, I'll have to go back. Inadvertently touch the thing. In almost all wallaby grasses, there are some hairs on the outside of what you might call the shoulders at the top of the sheath. It's not part of the ligule. You'll hear lots of people tell you, oh yeah, I can recognize a wallaby grass leaf because it's got the hairy ligule. Well, the ligule is hairy, but that's not what you can see. It's only 0.5 millimetre long and tucked down inside there, so you won't normally see it. What you will see are these, what I'm calling shoulder hairs. They're more conspicuous hairs. And we'll see this on, look, we'll probably see about 6 or 7 species of wallaby grass tomorrow, and we'll see a whole lot more in subsequent 2 weeks. And you'll get the idea that whilst they're not all as prominent as this, wallaby grasses will generally have these shoulder hairs. And in some species like this one, those hairs can continue in shorter form right around the back of the collar. So that's really useful for a wallaby grass. Other examples are weeping grass and common wheatgrass that I've got illustrated here. Common wheatgrass, well, both of these species have got what I'm going to call flanges, which would be familiar to anybody who's studying engineering, like you, Andrew. A flange is a structure that you might put on a pipe that fans out at right angles to the axis of the pipe. And that's what happens at the top of the sheath on these two species. You've got the sheath, the analogy to my pipe, and at the top of the sheath, it fans out at right angles to form a bit of a platform there, being the collar. And that's how that you can see in both of these cases. You'll see that the collar tissue is a different color here. That's because that's the meristem tissue that's putting on the new cells. A lot of grasses have a different color for the meristem tissue. Now, on the common wheatgrass, a native species, Anthosacne scabra, very common and widespread, which you'll see tomorrow. It not only has this flange-like appearance, but it also has, sometimes hard to see, but with a hand lens, you would usually see these little projections sticking out, and they sort of reach out. I think of them as reaching out to hug the stem, and they're called auricles in the books. So that this structure is quite distinctive for a common wheatgrass, and they tend to have these shaggy or mealy hairs on the sheaths as well. And there are other things that are distinctive that I'll show you in the field tomorrow, and I'll show you something distinctive about the seed heads before we finish at noon. Weeping grass, a bit similar, but no auricles. Auricles, by the way, also occur in other members of the cereal tribe within the grass family. We've got families of plants, they're divided into subfamilies if they're big enough. So we've got a subfamily in this case, and then the next level down of subdivision is the tribe, and then we've got the genus. Well, there can be subtribes too, but there is a tribe called Triticale, which includes wheat and barley and rye, also barley grass, ryegrass, and common wheatgrass. They're all in the same tribe, and many members of that tribe have got these auricles. So too does Festuca arundinacea, the tall fescue, which might be growing in your lawn at home. It's the flavour of the month for lawn grasses a couple of years ago. It has these little auricles as well. I'm going to leave the leaves next and talk about stems, unless anybody has any questions regarding leaves.
Graham, I just had a quick one regarding terminology, I suppose. When you use the word collar, that's kind of referring to all of those components that we were just talking about, the ligule, the flange, the auricle. That's kind of the whole region, the collar, correct?
That is correct. I looked for a definition online and in my references, and nobody seems to provide a succinct or precise definition of what can and can't be included in the term collar. But I think it makes sense to regard the collar as being something like the collar on my shirt here. That is, it's at the top of my shirt, and it includes this bit, but you can also include the bit underneath there, and on the inside and the outside. It's still the collar there as it is there. So I think the term collar you can interpret as including the whole lot. That's certainly what I'm going to encourage you to focus on. It definitely includes the meristem tissue with its often different color. So it includes, as well, you went through all the right things. I won't go back over through that.
Thanks for clarifying.
Any other questions? No? Then let's move on. And I better just check the time, 11:05. Okay, we're about where I thought we would be. That's good. Okay, I'm going to swap over to my other camera and show you a shoot of a grass plant. I pulled this one out of my veggie patch this morning. And once it's focused, yeah, look, we can see that this has got at the moment 3 leaves. We've got the oldest leaf, which is the one that whose sheath is wrapped around the others. I think you can see there that that leaf sheath is wrapped around the sheath of this second leaf on the right here. Okay, so I'm holding it by the blade there, and we can see the sheath. And you'll see that that sheath is emerging from the sheath of the previous leaf. Then the third leaf, I think you can see, is protruding out of the top of the sheath of the second leaf. Have a look at your own specimens. You'll see the same sort of thing if you've got any young shoots. You might not have collected any, but it's worthwhile looking at these. In fact, that might be something to do over the coming week or so, so to get used to the idea of what they look like. Pardon me. So we've got this mode of growth of a grass shoot, and this applies to the vast majority of grasses in Victoria and southeastern Australia, where a first leaf on a shoot is produced, and it will emerge with its sheath and its blade, even from its first emergence. You will see the sheath and the blade and the collar there, and you'll just see that one sheath. The next thing you'll see is the second leaf popping up through the sheath of the first one. And Ryan, okay, Ryan's disappeared off my screen now. So we've got the third leaf coming up now, and it's actually growing from the same point as the other 3 are, which is right down at the base here. There is meristem tissue there, and every leaf and the stem all emerge from down at the base, which on some annual grasses will be perhaps at ground level. In many grasses, particularly the perennial species, that will be below ground. So the growing points are actually below ground. That's an adaptation to grazing. Grazing animals and grasses are co-evolved. You couldn't have one without the other, or at least you could have grasses, but they wouldn't have evolved to become one of the biggest families of plants in the world so quickly in evolutionary terms. Okay, so I hope you've got this idea that each successive leaf emerges inside the effectively a cylinder of sheaths of the previous leaves. The second leaf arises with the protection of the sheath of the first leaf, and then the third leaf emerges in the protection of the cylinder formed by both the first and the second sheath, and so on. When a leaf is first developing right down at the base here, it's extremely tender and delicate. And so the support and protection of the sheaths is important to it. So in what we'd call a tufted grass species, one that doesn't just have runners and that sort of thing, in a tufted grass species, the mode of growth is that a new shoot would be put on. We can talk about how that happens later if you like. It'll have the first leaf, and then the second leaf will emerge inside its sheath, and then the third will emerge inside the other sheath, and so on, until it's flowering time. And right down in the base of this cylinder is the tiny bud of the seed head. It's already in there, it's just not developed. And come flowering time, which for most species is this time of the year, that's why we're doing the course now, that seed head ultimately is, well, what happens to bring it to the surface, except in that cuckoo that I showed you, is that each of the leaf bases joined to its own node has, well, the space between the nodes of these individual leaves, whilst at this stage it's negligible space between the nodes, they're all the nodes are packed together down at the base of the shoot. Come flowering time, the nodes separate from each other. the stem develops between the nodes. It's a little bit like one of those old car radio antennas. You remember that you'd press a button in the car, those of you who are old enough, and up would go your antenna. And the leaves are a little bit like they're attached to the different segments of this telescopic antenna. And so the stem effectively telescopes upwards and takes the leaves with it. So hopefully that makes sense to you. And so if you have a look at your specimens, you'll see a seed head sitting on top of a stem. And I'm going to get a specimen which is still just emerging. I hope I collected one like that. Yes, of course I did. Right, I've got here a thing called Earhata longiflora. That's what a seed head looks like once it's even starting to shed its seed, and you can see that that stem is protruding above a leaf. And if I go further down, one important aspect of the Earhata species of veld grasses that you'll see here is that the stems are branched. Not many grasses in Victoria are branched, but the Earhatas have branched stems. And look at this one here. We'll focus on that. And you can see that as the stem has been elongating, it's got a leaf whose sheath, in fact, there's two leaves there. I've got one leaf here and another leaf which is younger there, coming emerging from the first one. And then emerging from that leaf are the flowering parts of another seed head or inflorescence. And so this top leaf, when a botanist says top or above or whatever, they're meaning further away from the root system of the plant. Even if it happens to be hanging downwards, above would mean closer to the ground in that case. So when I say the top leaf, it's the one that's furthest out from the base of the plant. It has this important role of protecting the very tender, newly produced inflorescence or seed head. And as each of these spikelets, as they're called, emerges from the protection of the uppermost sheaths, and particularly the top one, which we give the name the flag leaf, they start to flower. Now, grasses are flowering plants. They do have pollen, of course. Anybody with hay fever knows about that. They also have an ovary and they have the vestiges of petals. They're much more highly evolved than those dull ancestors like orchids and lilies and so on. Much more interesting, the grasses. So they do have flowers in there, and they will put out their stigmas and anthers and so on, and flower as soon as they emerge. Okay, so let me stop using that camera, and I will share my screen again. And while I'm doing this, you can ask any questions. No questions, okay. Gee, I hope you're not just tuned out. I can see Andrea there. She doesn't look tuned out at all. Okay, so we've seen how the stems form within the leaf sheaths, and I've given you an example of a tussock or tuft-forming grass, a tufted grass, but it's a bit different with grasses that you might call reeds, such as common reed, or creeping or scrambling grasses. I'll give you a couple of examples of those. In fact, probably, look, I'll do that. Swapping between cameras and so on is a bit of a nuisance in Zoom, so I'll press on. But for the moment, just bear in mind that there is a difference with grasses that creep and climb, or that are upright like bamboos and common reed, because in those cases, instead of going through that early stage of a shoot developing where it puts up the first leaf, the second one that's tucked inside the first, and the third one that's tucked inside the first two, and so on, and finally elongating the stem, a scrambling, climbing, creeping grass or a reed-like grass or a bamboo will put up their first leaf, and it won't even have a blade in most cases. Then it will put up a bit of a stem and put its second leaf not inside the first one, but at the top of that bit of stem. And then it will produce another bit of stem with another leaf. So each leaf is produced out along the stem as the plant grows. So we've got those two quite different growth mechanisms. And Andrea, you're probably going to find this useful and interesting in your horticultural work. You'll see just how differently these things grow. And it's really helpful for identification. Most identification books and the keys in Vic Flora and so on will pay absolutely no attention to these really important and, when you look for them, really obvious differences. So that deals with that thing. So the other aspects of stems that are really important to note is whether they're upright or whether the stems creep along the ground like Paul's kikuyu, whether they're scrambling up trees such as the forest wiregrass that I'll show you in a minute, and so on. Grasses that creep or climb will always have branched stems. It's perhaps surprising, but that is the case. Some tufted grasses, like the Iahatas, also have branched stems. That's a property of the whole genus. In fact, this does tend to be a property that goes with the genus, but there's probably some genus where you've got some members that creep and others that don't. I just can't think of any. So branching is something that's really important to note. And I mentioned that in case of Corey's fountain grass, that helps to distinguish it from some similar looking natives, because Corey said that people can confuse that with a native. Height is useful, but although it does vary between species, it also varies within a species depending on growing conditions and stage of growth. So if you've got something that's really tall, like if it's 5 meters tall, you can probably identify it as a bamboo or common reed, giant reed. It's helpful, but if it's smaller, you don't know whether it might still be giant reed, but just a small shoot of it. And the second last thing to mention about the stems is that in the grass family, it's extremely rare for a flowering stem not to have some nodes. They're the bits that the grass leaves are attached to, and also where the side branches are produced, if they are, because as Andrea would know from her horticultural stuff, all new growth on a plant comes from the axils of leaves, or practically all. And that's what happens with the grass. New side branches and new shoots are always formed at the base of a leaf sheath, nodes. And nearly all grasses in Victoria, you will find at least one, and usually 2 or more leaf nodes between the root system and the seed head or inflorescence. There are a couple, I can think of a few exceptions. There are 2 alpine wallaby grasses, and rye beetle grass is the other one, Tripogonella lolliiformis, a native species. And the other 440 roughly Victorian grass species will have nodes that you will see, at least if you go looking for them. Whereas in the sedge family, Cyperaceae, and the rush family, Juncaceae, particularly the rushes themselves, the Juncus genus, you will find that many, but not all, of the species have no nodes. It tends to go with the genus. Not within Juncus. Juncus is like a super genus. If the orchidologists were to get onto it, it'd be split up into different families, I think. But certainly within the sedge family, it tends to go with genus, so that in the genus Carex or Carex and the genus Cyperus or Cyperus or various other pronunciations, there's never a node. So that can be quite useful to narrow down what species of grassy plant you've got, and also to distinguish those grassy looking plants from other families if they don't have any nodes. And the last thing about stems is that if you've got a grassy looking plant and you find that it's got a triangular cross section to the stem, and you'd be looking just underneath the seed head ideally, then it's going to be in the sedge family. It will not be a grass. It never happens within the grasses. It happens in certain genera of the sedge family. Genera is just a plural of genus. And we're talking there about the ones that I was just talking about before. That's Carex or Carex and Cyperus. Also Bulbochinus, and actually only one of our two Chenoplectus species. So triangular cross sections are quite useful to notice. And if it's formed in a particular plant within that sedge family, it will be best developed just under the seed head. Some of you will know of Carex tereticollis, terete meaning cylindrical in cross section, cylindrical, round in cross section, and collis means stem, as in cauliflower refers to flowers on the stem. So Carex tereticollis, the scientific name literally means with a round stem, but have a look just underneath the seed head and you'll find that it's triangular there. It's got that telltale bit. The other thing that goes with a triangular stem, and we'll probably see this out in the field, is that each of the leaves radiates from the edge of one or other of the three edges of the triangular stems. So when you look at a shoot edge on, even before the stem's formed, they radiate at 120-degree angles. That is evenly spaced in three directions around the compass. So that can be quite useful. Okay, now we've seen how ultimately our grass seed head emerges from the flag leaf, as it's called. And as each spikelet or flowering package emerges, it starts to flower. So it flowers from the top to the bottom. And that's the opposite of nearly every other part of the plant kingdom, where new growth is generally put on at the tips so that the youngest bits are at the top. In the case of a grass, it's upside down. And so if you wanted to find the ripest of the seeds on a grass plant, you look to the top of the seed head. The other thing is that as the seed head emerges from its flag leaf, it keeps on going until in nearly all species, the seed head, once fully developed, will be protruding well clear of its flag leaf. That's really important if you're going to collect seeds or if you're going to test seeds for ripeness. And we'll do that outdoors tomorrow. But for the moment, I'll just mention that it is very common for a grass seed head to abort along the way. It could be because of frosts, like at Reedsdale when I was teaching people on Friday. There were a whole lot of wallaby grass seed heads that looked straw-coloured and people presumed that they were all ripe. And I said, no, look, the seed heads haven't fully emerged from their flag leaf. They might look ripe and they've gone fluffy, as a ripe one would, but the seed heads haven't emerged beyond their flag leaf, so they've aborted. And we checked for seeds. I showed them the tiny grains of wallaby grasses, and there weren't any because they'd aborted. So if you find a grass that looks like it's ripe, but it hasn't fully protruded above its flag leaf, then it's very unlikely to be ripe. The other thing is, if you're wanting to check for a ripe seed, such as it might be Chilean needlegrass, and you want to know whether it's too late to put machinery in there, or say a slasher. Slashing Chilean needlegrass before it's ripe is a really good thing to do in most cases. Doing it a week later, once it's got seed on, is the worst possible thing you can do, because that's pretty much the only way that the seeds are spread, via slashers, graders, and other machinery. they don't spread much at all by other means. So getting the ripeness of seeds is really critical to management, and also if you want to collect seeds, as somebody like Andrea might want to do for Marinara Gardens. Okay, so if you are wanting to check for ripe seed, as we will do tomorrow, you look around amongst the members of the species of interest for a seed head that is protruding as much as any others above the flag leaf, and you go to the top of it and you check for seeds there. And you do it with your thumbnail and forefinger, and I'll show you that tomorrow outdoors. And Andrea, you make sure I do that in case I forget. Okay. Now, there are just a couple of sorts of grasses where the seed heads don't always protrude fully above the flag leaf, even though they might be fully developed and have ripe seed. They're Vulpia myuros, or rat's tail fescue, introduced, and a couple of tribolium species. I've only ever seen one of them. The other one is really rare, a rare weed. And I should be able to show you Vulpia myuros tomorrow, I expect. Okay. At that point, we're going to start looking at grass seeds. Has anybody got any questions about the development of the stem and the emergence of the seed head and so on? No? Well, that's good, because we've only got 33 minutes left, and I want to make sure I get through everything. I think we're on track. Okay. Let's talk now about the seeds of a grass plant. You'd be familiar with the concept that in your breakfast cereal, if you eat cereal, you've got some grains. It might be oats or wheat or something like that, corn. Each of those is a grain, and you probably know that when those grains are harvested, they don't come just as the grain. When they're on the plant, they are surrounded by husks. In fact, we've bred up wheat in particular, and other cereal crops too, some of the other cereal crops, so that as the header goes through and really shakes the seeds, the grain will actually fall out fairly readily. You can see the advantage of that. But in a grass plant, with the exception of rat's tail fescue and some of the love grasses, not rat's tail fescue, sorry, rat's tail. I mentioned rat's tail fescue before, that's why that was in my mind. There are two grasses that are like chalk and cheese, other than they're both introduced: rat's tail grass, Sporobolus africanus, and the rat's tail fescue, Vulpia myuros. Anyway, the Sporobolus species shed their grains separately without having any husks attached to them. In fact, they become sticky when they're wet, so that they stick onto particularly dogs going for walks around residential areas. So with the exception of a few Sporobolus species and a few love grasses, the vast majority of members of the grass family worldwide shed their seeds in the form of a grain surrounded by some husks. And occasionally those grains inside the husks are shed on the whole seed head that blows around on the wind, and the individual seeds are dropped as the seed head blows around the landscape. So we've got this concept of something that is rather special in the grass family. This is perhaps the distinctive thing about the grass family. Their seeds are dispersed with the grains being protected by some surrounding husks. The number of surrounding husks varies from species to species, commonly two, but it can be one or it can be many. So that is an important aspect of the grass family, with very few exceptions. What you'll find is that the grass seeds within your seed head may be so densely packed that you won't see them. It can be really confusing looking at something like Maria's Yorkshire Fog seed head. Now, what example did I get of that? Probably my wallaby grass would be a good example, and I should have got a better one. I was thinking of Maria's Yorkshire fog. Maria, you might want to get your specimen ready. Okay, I'll stop sharing the screen and I'll go to my camera. Maria, do you happen to have your specimen at the ready?
Yes, he's here.
Good, good, all right. Perhaps what I'll do first is I'll show you the technique with my wallaby grass here. This is clustered wallaby grass. Now, you've got a whole lot of things in there and it's a bit hard to, well, I can work out what a seed is because one has just fallen out. This is getting ripe, and just to prove what I was saying, it's falling out of the top there once it focuses. Okay, you can see that it's left behind at the top some empty glooms, as they're called, where the seeds have been falling out. There's a few more that have just come out. Down the bottom, it's still quite green. And there's my flag leaf there. You can see the blade of the flag leaf there. There we are. And you can see where it's bending is the sheath. So it's still emerging out of its flag leaf, I think. Oh, no, perhaps that's all the blade. Yeah, that's all the blade. There's the collar further down. It's just been damaged where it was bending. Just so that I can convince you that it does actually have a collar. Okay, you've got to look for it, but once this gets in focus, we will see the collar somewhere here. It's hard to do this with the camera, but I am seeing a collar there. Come on, focus. It's not very obvious on this one because it's gone all brown and tatty. With a hand lens, you would see it much more clearly. Anyway, that's not what I've got this for. It is to show you that we've got a seed head here and it's got things called spikelets in it. We can see some glooms at the end. And what I recommend is that when a seed head is so densely packed with bits that you have trouble working out what's what, that you flex it. And so if I flex this, then I start to see that there are branches radiating from the central stem. The part of the stem that's up inside the inflorescence or seed head is called the rachis, and that would be an important term for somebody like Shelby who wants to know all the botanical ins and outs and terminology. And if I flex a branch, then I start to see the individual spikelets more clearly. So if I were to grab that spikelet, I can see it's got bristles sticking out the end of my spikelet there. And if I grab those bristles and pluck them out, now I've got some seeds. Actually, that's a bit confusing too, because in fact, there are multiple seeds in there. And here's the trick, I might as well show you now. When we go out in the field and you pluck out the seeds from a wallaby grass or a whole range of other grass species where there's several seeds within each pair of glooms, the trick is you pluck them out using thumb and forefinger like that. And with your other hand, you push it and watch what happens. See how that's breaking up into the individual seeds. You can see that they're arranged in a zigzag fashion along a little stalk running up through the middle. I told you the name Rachilla before. Shelby, this little stalk through the middle is called the, sorry, I told you about the rachis before. This little stalk running up the middle there is called the Rachilla. So Rachilla just means a little rachis. Okay, so we've got some seeds there, and the message that I'm trying to get across is that if an inflorescence or seed head is so dense that you can't work out what's going on inside it, try flexing it. In nearly all cases, you will see that there are some side branches. If you don't, that's really important because that really narrows down the identity. So Maria, I'm going to hand focus over to you. Can you show us your Yorkshire fog seed head and show us what happens when you flex it, please?
Yeah, actually, you can see the branches coming because at the beginning it looks like a tail, but then once you start flexing it, you can see all these little branchlets coming.
Yes, And you can develop the technique of flexing each one of those branches until finally you get down to the smallest of stalks that have something at the end of a stalk. And that something is always a spikelet. And the spikelet is where the seeds reside. So I would encourage you to do lots of flexing and get used to that technique of trying to get down to the point where you can see the smallest branches. Another thing that's useful is to focus at the top of your inflorescence. So with my wallaby grass, for example, if I put that up there, I think that'll do for the time being. I can flex that around, and often there's less confusion when you look at the top because I'll swap cameras. What you find is that when grasses have, well, the majority of grasses will have lots of branching down the base and decreasing amounts of branching towards the top. And so it can be less confusing if you look around the top. So I find it easiest if I flex that bit at the top. But if I want to find the overall structure, then I need to have a look further down. And then I see that it's actually got quite long branches in there, which wasn't at all apparent just by looking at it like that. The other thing is that these branches on many grass species, a large proportion of grass species, whilst they may look quite dense at this ripe stage, and they will always look very slender when they're emerging from their flag leaf because they've been tucked inside the sheath of the flag leaf. When they're shedding their pollen and getting pollinated, the phase that a botanist would call anthesis, the branches usually fan out at wide angles. So this species, when it was in flower, would have had these branches sticking out like that, and would look totally different, don't you think? And so people well, it is very common for people not to realize that that two apparently different looking specimens are actually of the same species, but at different stages. Yorkshire fog would be a very good example of that. So Maria has a mature one, and as she said, it looks, the seed head looks a bit like an animal's tail at first sight at the moment. But when it's flowering at this anthesis stage, it looks like a cone with the point at the top, with all the branches sticking out pretty close to right angles, or at least it takes around, well, for Yorkshire fog, typically 2 to 3 days, depending on the weather, to go from flowering at the top to the bottom. And you can find sometimes that the top branches are fanned out and the bottom is still slender. And the next day you might find that the middle part is spreading wide, the top's closed up a bit and the bottom hasn't opened yet. And on the next day, the bottom will be fanned right out, but the top will be completely closed. If you get ideal conditions, though, all the branches will be out at the same time and will look conical. So that's something to be wary of.
Can I just show you these two? I think they are exactly the
Excellent.
same. But
Yep.
you just said, let me, I'm gonna move. So I think
Put
this
them
is
closer
the,
to your face, Maria, and then the camera will be able to focus on your face as well as
my
those.
face. I better do this, I guess. So I think, as you mentioned, one is the mature one. Can you see them, maybe?
Yes, yes, we can see them, Maria. You've got, yeah, it's blurring the background and it thinks they're the background, but I think that was quite clear. That was a good example.
Oh, well, yeah.
Well done. We will see that out in the field too, I expect. Okay, any other questions or comments?
Graham, just something I noticed as I was pulling a little spikelet of my Rotidosperma species apart there. You mentioned that the seeds generally ripen from the top to the bottom of the plant, and I seem to notice that that's the same from spikelet to spikelet, so to speak, that the seeds sort of higher up in the spikelet are more ripe and the ones lower down in the spikelet are less. So would you sort of back that up as a bit of a character?
Sorry, Corey, no, I can't. A spikelet will have simultaneous flowering of all of the seeds within the spikelet. You'll see that in the mornings, grasses flower in the morning. So that's one advantage of you being in the morning group. We will probably see it happening tomorrow. And what you're noticing though is that the seeds are falling out more readily and appearing to be riper at the top of the spikelet, meaning the seeds, or we'll call them seeds for the moment, at that are furthest from the glooms. But that's because although they were all pollinated within an hour of each other, probably within minutes of each other, the seeds are shed sequentially from the top to the bottom. And so this process called disarticulation, scientists always have to have jargon, don't they? The first seed will be the first one to shed, and then the second, oh sorry, the top one is the first one to be shed, and then the next one down. So it does it progressively. You can see why that might be, because if, for example, it dropped or disarticulated the bottom seed, the one next to the glooms, then what would fall out would be a clump of several seeds, and they would land on the ground together. Whereas it's better from the point of view of dispersal if they're shed one by one. The wind, for example, might blow the first ones in one direction, the next ones in another direction, and so on.
Thanks for clarifying.
No worries. Anyone else?
Just one quick one. If you cut a seed head that is not mature, will it mature even that is not attached to the roots?
This is important, particularly in the context of Chilean needlegrass, because a lot of people have been told, and that would apply to the NARP team, of which Maria is a member, that with Chilean needlegrass, it's such a terrible grass because even if you cut it, the seeds can still ripen. Now, Andrea is a horticulturalist, so she will know that once you sever the stem, there'll be no sap flow, and grass seeds rely on the sap flow for the seeds to develop and ripen in general terms. And so as soon as the stem is cut, there will be no further sustenance provided to the developing grain, which is the important bit for germination, of course. That doesn't, So Maria, does that cover it? That once you cut the grass, the grains will get no more sustenance from the parent plant?
Yes, it makes sense. Thank you. Yep.
I should perhaps go on and say that that doesn't mean that once the seeds get to us, or the grains get to a certain stage, I'll start my sentence again. Once a grain develops to a certain point, and we'll look at this in the field, once it becomes sort of pasty in texture, which you can tell with your thumbnail and forefinger, they have probably got enough starch, endosperm, for a germinating plant, and the embryo is probably well developed. And so even although the plant wasn't quite ready to shed it, the grain, it might not be as fit for the environment as one that can go a bit further, but it might have enough that under at least good conditions, it will be able to germinate, even though it's not fully developed. So I'm going to show you in the field how to check when a grass gets to that sort of pasty stage of the grain, at which point I'm starting to think that it might be able to germinate, at least in good enough conditions. I think of it in terms of human development, fetal development. You know, if an unborn child gets to something like 29 weeks, which will be resonant with one of us here, they might not be fully developed by the parent, but still be able to reach a full and happy life. So I think that's the gist of the story that is often confused with Chilean needlegrass. Any other questions or comments on that? Okay, I'm going to go back to my slides. I'm going to see if there's a keyboard shortcut for swapping to the last slides. Okay, so we've done the flexing bit, and that's a really important skill to cultivate. It turns out that the seeds of a grass plant tend to be very distinctive of each species, so that if you give me a grass seed, just one seed of a grass, with a few exceptions, I'll probably be able to tell you what species it is. I'll certainly be able to tell you what genus it's in. Poas can be a bit tricky, so I might not be able to narrow it down to one single species with poa. But as a rule, you give me a grass seed, I'll tell you the species. So they are really good for identification, and we focus quite a lot on these seeds for identification. Where's my cursor gone? There we are. Okay, once the seeds have fallen, on most species, but not all, the seeds leave behind a pair of glumes. The glumes being what you might think of as the outermost part of the spikelet. So I've drawn a typical pair of glumes, which in this case has shed its seed or seeds. And that's true of most species, but as I mentioned with the fountain grass that Corey showed us, it drops the glumes as well. And in fact, the branching that we used the flexing technique to see before would reveal in Corey's case that flexing just makes the whole thing disintegrate, and lots of seeds or immature seeds will fall off with the glumes, and it just leaves that bare stalk. In the case of barley grasses and also red-leg grass, Bothria cloamacra, and silky bluegrass, Dichanthium sericium, they're two native species. As the seeds are shed, the individual branches of the seed head fragment off with the seeds. So again, you're left with nothing except the top of the stem at the end, no husks left behind. And that's really important for identification. But for most species, glumes are left behind. And for these reasons, when you want to identify a grass, it is most easily done if you have a ripe seed head. You'll be able to see the seeds more readily. They will have developed all their, or the hairs and so on will be sticking out the way they do when they dry out. You'll be able to count how many of them, because they won't be packed together as I showed you when I had that package of spikelets of a package of seeds of the wallaby grass that I had to poke with my other hand to separate them. And you can see whether the glumes fall off with the seeds or as part of the seed. So all of those things make ripeness a useful feature. That's why I don't run these courses any earlier in the season. It'd be good in the sense that if you could learn about the grasses earlier, then you'd be able to have more practice before there isn't any flowering material, and you might be able to act on your knowledge with management techniques whilst it's still a good time of year to do it. But it really helps to have ripe flowering material. Okay, now it turns out that more than half of Victorian grass species have seeds that include a bristle. Well, if it's a quite prominent bristle, or sometimes even if it isn't, or if it's got a specific function, as they nearly all do, we would call such a bristle an awn. And here's some in a photograph I took up near Bendigo, and you can see the wavy awns of a speargrass. And a speargrass, well, I can see the grain-bearing part, we call this the lemma, You can see a red-brown bit there. At least I don't know how good your reception is from Zoom, and I'm seeing it much clearer on my screen than you are, I'm sure, but take it from me, I can see a red-brown bit down here, which is the grain-bearing part. I can't see any others there. Oh, yes, I can. Up here, I can see the grain-bearing part, the lemma, and I can see that there is like a spear shaft, hence speargrass. In this particular species of speargrass, above the straight shaft, as it dries out, it produces this sickle shape. So you can see all these wavy sickles around the place. Or at least the blade part of the sickle is wavy, and then it's got a straight bit. That straight bit is twisted like a rope or like a barbershop pole. And they go that way as they dry out. I can also see Ritidosperma fulvum there. Yes, you really can tell a species from a seed. That's Ritidosperma fulvum. I can tell by how fluffy it is. It's got a little awn on, but I can't see that there. I do have some that I prepared earlier though. No, look, when I collected my specimens, as you've done, I had some ripe seed on them. You've quite likely got some ripe seed as well. And if you've got an oat with its awns, that would be good. A speargrass would do, a kangaroo grass would do. But oats are perhaps the best for demonstrating this. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to swap cameras. Now, where are my seeds? There they are. Okay, out of my specimens that I collected, I've got my oat seed. You might have one that looks like that too. And I've got a kangaroo grass seed, which looks a lot like a speargrass seed, although the structure is vastly more complicated. Now, they've dried out. The awns were actually completely straight when these were in their pairs of glooms, or in the case of the kangaroo grass, inside its spathe. I won't go into the details. Trust me, the kangaroo grass doesn't have glooms there. The glooms are actually inside that thing. Now, the reason why a grass does this in the majority of Victorian species is illustrated by what happens when they get wet. Remember, they've dried out and twisted. I've got a spray. I'm now going to spray them with water. I'm just using an atomizer here. So let's see what happens when I spray them with water. Now, it'll take a moment for the water to get to them, particularly the kangaroo grass. Now, your microphones are all muted, otherwise I'd hear gasps, I'm sure. Okay, so if I can get that one back and have it stay there for a while. There goes the kangaroo grass, it's now mobile. So the majority of grass species in Victoria have these awns. Now, awns can just be straight and uninteresting, but most grass species have got these sorts of awns that twist on drying. When they get wet, they untwist. When they dry out again, they go back and forward. So what would happen to these seeds once they've got on the ground or in fur or feathers is that they will wriggle. And you know what it's like with grass seeds. You can't pull them back out the way they go in because they've got things like the hairs that you'll see on, well, it might be hard to see the hairs on the kangaroo grass, but it's got a sharp point and it's got hairs that point back towards the awn. That's on all of the seeds that have these sorts of awns. There are hairs or raspy shark's tooth sort of projections that make the seed want to go towards the sharp point. And that photograph, I didn't point it out at the time because I wanted to demonstrate what was going on. In that photograph, what's happened is that the seeds have got to a point where they've hit an irregularity in the ground or a little bit of moss or something like that, and that's interrupted their passage. And so we've got a bump here, and here is my wriggling seed. It gets to that point. And of course, because the awn has a bend in it, as it spins around, it will lift the seed up. and it will keep lifting it up until it's sort of wedged itself in somewhere, and then the awn will just spin around in the air and not do anything. So it ultimately gets the seed pointing somewhat vertically, but not horizontal to the ground at any rate, and with a little fissure or something. So it initiates the process of secreting the seed, particularly the grain part, in the ground. And because of those shark's tooth raspy projections and the hairs and so on, it won't come back out again. It will just gradually ease itself into the soil. When I say gradually, they have generally worked their way into the top layer of soil within a couple of weeks. It depends how hard the surface of the ground is and climatic factors and all that sort of stuff. But they are remarkably adept at getting around the landscape, including through fur and feathers and that sort of thing. And they are also very good at getting into the ground. Now, with a spear grass, or particularly a needle grass, that's a bit of a problem if they don't get to the ground, but instead get into wool or an animal's fur or something like that, because those sharp points. Now, I've had vets do this course a number of times, and they have horror stories about what happens. Perhaps I'll just say that needlegrass seeds can get into animals' kidneys, and speargrass and needlegrass and a range of other things can get around eyes of animals, and it can be very unpleasant. But it is devilishly clever, these grasses, the way they get around the landscape. Now, you can try that yourself. You'll convince yourself that it isn't just me with some wind-up model grass seeds there. Wallaby grass seeds do it, spear grass seeds do it, Yorkshire fog does, Maria. As I said, the majority of grass seeds. In fact, with the blown grass seeds, the awns are so fine and tightly wound up that when I put a seed under a microscope to identify which species of Lachnogrossus I've got, when and this is with a dissecting microscope, so I'm looking at the microscope and my breath is gently playing over the specimen. And every time I breathe out, the thing wriggles around one way, and then I breathe in and then it dries out a bit. And when I breathe out again, so the thing's continually wriggling around on the microscope stage. So it's actually quite useful. Here's a tip. Post-it notes, that's what I'm trying to say. Post-it notes with the sticky side up, put your seed on the post-it note, and then you can move your seed around on the post-it note, but the seed won't wriggle around out of your way in the way that my oat seed wriggled off my hand. Okay, now I saw something in the chat. We've got two things in chat there. My work socks are daily testament to the penetrative qualities of stiper seeds. Stiper meaning ostrostipers and nucellas and those sorts of things. Yeah. However, I reckon you'll find a lot more by number of the Vulpia species. We'll have a look at them tomorrow. They are remarkable how they get into socks and shoelaces. And Amanda says, my cat got a great ear piercing. Okay. Yes, went straight through. Okay, better than getting stuck there. They're really irritating when you get a grass seed stuck in yourself. I know from experience. And Carolyn Pilley, who is really Corey, says, anybody hand someone Ostrostipus scabra? Ouch. Yes, these things often have particularly sharp points. That's one of the identifying features for a speargrass that we will use tomorrow. We'll see. Yeah, we'll use the sharpness of the point to identify speargrasses as that group rather than as opposed to any similar sort of grass. Great Q Hill. What's that about? Oh, well, what are the advantages of some seeds such as Ritidospermus? Oh, and by the way, I pronounce it Ritidosperma. Ritid is the correct Latin pronunciation, I'm told. It means a wrinkle. Ritidosperma means wrinkled seed. Dare I digress? They don't really have wrinkled seeds. It was a stuff up by the person who first described the genus. Anyway, being so hairy. It's hairy, firstly, because, some seeds are not at all hairy. We'll see some of those, but particularly in the Alps, they've got bugger all seeds. Wind is something that aids dispersal, and a hairy seed catches the wind a lot better. The hairs always, again, point backwards from the point of the seed, which isn't as sharp as a spear grass, but it's still got a point called a callus, and the hairs point back outwards, so they still have that wedging sort of function. Once they get into a nook or a cranny, which, of any kind around ground level, they don't come out, they don't want to come out. Try putting some in a paper bag, Gil. I recommend doing that. Grab some wallaby grass seed, put them in a paper bag, and after you've carried them around for a little while, you try getting them out of the corner. But then you'll know what the advantage of those hairs are. They are particularly good. Okay, doesn't it make it harder to penetrate the soil? No, it doesn't make it harder, Gil, because the hairs are quite soft. So whilst they don't want to come back out the way they've gone into wherever they've got to, they are nevertheless less soft. So they will fold back against the surface of the seed, the lemma as it's technically called. So it doesn't really stop them penetrating their soil. And as Ryan says, that's a good question. And Paul says we regularly have issues with stiper, that would be seeds in our dog's fur and embedding in skin. Yeah, yes, and I know from 30 years ago when I first met Paul, he was at the Hillsville Sanctuary, so he's had a lot of experience with animals. Yeah, so grass seeds can be a real animal welfare issue, but that issue existed long before there were humans. Okay, and Stiper tenacissima back home in Spain is a nightmare too with pets. Yes, Gil's from Spain, and one of the stipers there, which is called, now I think in Australia, isn't it sold under the name of Mexican feathergrass? You might be able to correct me about that, Gil, but
not really sure. I think English name is steppe grass, could be.
Okay.
Not really sure. Haven't seen it in nurseries here.
Yeah, well, I could be wrong. I might be confusing it with tenuissima. There's so many stiper species in the Northern Hemisphere that I might be confusing it with tenuissima in that case. Yeah, I think that's right. Mexican feathergrass, I think, is tenuissima. All around the world where, the temperate zones of the world, which is where you'll find most of these, and into the tropics in Mexico and other parts of Central America, these groups are important. Now, I'm worried about time. Oh, we're over time already. Okay, I'm going to zoom ahead. If you have to go, then perhaps I better give you instructions for tomorrow. But for the rest of you, I'll cover just a few more things. As I said, I always tend to run out of time. Now, for tomorrow, I'll meet you out on Missons Road in Toulon Vale at 9 a.m. or a bit before. Park on the northern side of the road. That way, traffic which comes down those gravel roads, particularly the adjacent Coburn's Road, isn't it, at high velocity, won't affect you. And we'll all be on the same side of the road so that we're not blocking off what is a narrow gravel road. Don't park right on top of the native grasses. Just at the very edge, there's a weedier bit, but don't go right up onto the grassland. It's a site of national significance. Other things to point out, for your comfort, there are no toilets at any of the field trip sites we have, just a warning. And I better find out where the nearest toilets are to Toulon Vale. There is a service station in Toulon Vale, particularly if you buy petrol there. I imagine you can use the toilet there. I think that's what I've been told. Occupational health and safety. Well, the weather is going to be a bit challenging with potential rain, even thunderstorms, which may force us to take cover in the vehicles. There could be snakes, I wish. There could be bull ants, although they're quite rare there. COVID-19, of course, is something that we have to deal with in all of these sorts of situations. If you take ill, if you have any symptoms, please don't come. go and get tested and so on. Now, Andrea asked what to do in the situation that somebody is a primary or secondary contact. I'm hoping that once you're notified that that is your status, that they will tell you whether you can come. I really don't know what the rules are other than the instructions given to businesses are that for adult education, you can be on site as long as, well, even without vaccination, if you can't do it online, and obviously our field trips you can't do online. So please be sensible if you are a primary or secondary contact, and follow whatever advice you're given at the time or whatever you can find out about that. And certainly if you've got symptoms, don't come. Now, wear some decent boots and clean them before you come to make sure there's no seeds or soil on them. Lots of other people introduce soil and seeds and so on, but I don't want my mob to be contributing to weeds there. And if you're bringing specimens for me to identify, which you can do, bring them in a plastic bag that's sealed, again, so that we don't introduce seeds to the site. Are there any questions about the field trip tomorrow? No? Okay. Then if you have to go at any time from now on, do so, but I will just go through a little bit more. And those who do miss out on this, I will make sure that
Sorry, Graham, just a quick question. I'll bring along the documents that you sent through. Were hand lenses being provided tomorrow, or we had to source our own?
I have got some hand lenses, Ben, and you're welcome to borrow those just for the morning, because they'll have to be used for the afternoon group too. Anybody who's got their own, obviously, please bring them. I will bring some. I won't sanitize them. I don't think I can do that very well without smearing the lenses. So I'd ask you, after using one of my hand lenses, to clean them up with a tissue or something like that pretty thoroughly, and keep your hands clean with hand sanitizer before handling them.
Thanks.
And I've got 2 lenses, so we can share them between us.
Okay. Any other questions? No? Okay, so for those of you who can hang on a little bit longer, and Andrew, you're dismissed if you're still there, I will share my screen again, and we'll just go through a couple more things at high speed. Okay, there's the speargrass seeds wedging themselves into the ground. Now, a spikelet comprises the glumes and the 1 or more seeds within them. The grass family can be divided broadly into genera that only ever have 1 seed inside each pair of glumes, and the rest of the family never has just 1. So a grass genus like Ostrostipa will always have just 1 seed in its pair of glumes, whereas any other, the other type of species in the grass family will never have 1. And my illustration here is styled on a poa with multiple seeds. And in this case, the seeds comprise a lemma, which is the larger of the 2 husks, a palea, which is a small one tucked inside the lemma, and the grain develops down in there. We'll look at that sort of thing tomorrow. Here's a picture of a wallaby grass at that anthesis stage that I mentioned, where it's shedding its pollen. We'll skip over that. The branching in a seed head is really important. So in finding a grass that differs as much as possible from the 3 basic ones that I got you to search for, you'd be looking at something like the paspalum here, where the seeds are attached directly, or actually every second one's got a really tiny stalk, but otherwise directly to this branch and so on. Then we've got couch and windmill grass, which we'll see tomorrow, pardon me, where the seeds are attached on the undersides of branches radiating from the top of the stem. I'll show you common wheatgrass tomorrow, and it has its spikelets attached directly to that top part of the stem, what we call the rachis, and you'll see that they alternate on this screen from top to bottom. And that's the same sort of structure as ryegrass, where again the spikelets have no stalks to them. They are attached, even recessed into the stem, and they alternate between the two sizes. So there are these different arrangements of branching. The most common type is represented by the Yorkshire fog here and the love grass at the bottom right. The Yorkshire fog, as Maria has shown us, looks really dense when it's mature, but fans open to be more like the love grass picture here when it's ripe, when it's flowering rather. Then we've got kangaroo grass. I'll talk about that tomorrow. It's a remarkable species, and its branching and lots about the seed head is totally different from any other species in Victoria except the oat kangaroo grass, which is really rare. That's Thermida avanacea. I might bring some seed along of Thermida avanacea, yeah, in case any of you ever go to Boort or Charlton, which are the places where you'd see it in Victoria. Okay, what to check first for ID? I think I might skip through that and talk about that tomorrow. Whoops, too far. No, this will do. Wallaby grasses, I'm going to show you in the field, but first it's good if we've had a look at pictures of them on a screen where we can all see the same thing enlarged. Here's a wallaby grass seed, a fairly typical one. It's actually a Tasmanian endemic species, but it's very similar to Rhythodosperma penicillata that we'll see out at Montrose. And why are they called wallaby grasses? I didn't know when somebody asked me, but somebody said they thought it was because if you look at a seed like this, it's a bit like a wallaby with two long legs and a tail. And I thought, well, that's very creative. I wonder what they're on. And then somebody else said, I thought it was because when you look at the seed this way up, it looks a bit like the head of a wallaby. But I thought, gee, I wonder what they're on, because wallabies do not have a horn in between their two ears. And then I thought, a unicorn does. I am going to call them unicorn grasses for the purpose of communicating with you out in the field. What I mean is that if I tell you to look for hairs just below the unicorn's horn, you'll know that I'm talking about this sort of level. And if I say to look at the hairs at the tip of the unicorn's snout, you'll know I mean these ones. And if I say look at the back of the unicorn's head and see the palea, the husk at the back, you'll know I'm talking about this bit that you can see just sticking up there behind the horn, or orn as you now know to call them. Whoops, no, that'll do. Oh, no, I'll go back very quickly. Here's a close-up of a wallaby grass orn, and you'll see that it isn't like a barbershop pole, as in the case of the oat and the spear grasses and all other grass species in Victoria, except silky bluegrass, Dicanthus sericium. Only wallaby grasses and silky bluegrass have orns that twist not like rope or a barbershop pole, but like curling ribbon. We're getting into Christmas now, it's the 1st of December. Think curling ribbon, think wallaby grass. And here's the other sort of structure. If you look up close at oat orn or this 5-orn spear grass, you can see that the twisting is still more or less circular in cross section. It's terete, as a botanist would say. Now, here's how a wallaby grass seed develops. It's a video. It's speeded up by a factor of 4, and it can be a bit cantankerous to make it work. Here it goes. I've just plucked it out of its blooms. I had to get it onto a little daub of blue tack incredibly quickly because this happened within a few seconds. This is speeded up by a factor of 4. And about now, I sprayed it with my atomizer. There you go. You can see it wound back for a moment. So that's what happens with a wallaby grass seed. It starts off with all the hairs flush, and then the orn, and as it's fallen to the ground, it does this. Right, that's enough of that. Whoops, no, one more thing. We're also going to see, I don't know, about 7 species of speargrass tomorrow. I hope we won't see any Chilean needlegrass. Oh, we might, because I did see some a couple of years ago and I pulled them out. But if there's one there, even though I pulled the 1 or 2 out, there could be more. So we might see a needlegrass down the bottom. And the distinction, well, the acid test distinction for a needlegrass is that at the base of the awn, this shaft here, where it joins on to the grain-bearing part called the lemma, there is this rim of tissue called a corona. And Gil, Spanish for crown is corona, right? If Gil's still with us. Perhaps he's not. Anyway, take it from me, that's a corona. You don't get one on a speargrass. And that is it for this session. I'm sorry I've gone over time by 16 minutes. If you want to get a copy of these slides, you can download them from that website. Does anybody have any questions before I sign off?
Is it possible to watch this recording again?
Yes. As I mentioned at the start, you're a bit late, Maria. I am recording this because 2 of us couldn't make it this morning. And so this is being recorded and I will send everyone a link to the recording. And if you have to miss a subsequent webinar, you might be in the situation of needing that too. Any other questions? No?
Good, thanks.
Okay. Class dismissed. I'll look forward to seeing you out at Misson's Road. Oh, the other thing, you might want to bring something to eat and drink. We'll have a break halfway through. 4 hours is a bit long to go without anything. Yeah, so I look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning. Bye.
Thanks, Graham.
Thanks, Graham.
Thanks,
Graham.
Graham.
Thanks, Graham. See ya.
Thanks, Graham.
Thanks, Graham. See you tomorrow.